Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, mine dominant herons, senors and senoritas, comic book fans all over the globe. Welcome back to Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, world-renowned, world-famous, globally recognized as a comic book god. You get to ask me questions about what I do for a living, and what I do for a living is I write comic books. Let's jump right into it. Mark Ayers, what's your favorite part about writing the new Conan books? Everything. I really like this character. I was introduced to Conan when I was about 14 through the Lancer paperbacks. It's where a lot of us boomers discovered Conan at our local drugstore in the paperback racks. And just fell in love with the character. 14, your hormones are raging. Conan is like the perfect vehicle for those feelings. And what I like about writing it is, I love the action scenes. I really like the character. I think I get the character. But mostly what I like about writing the prose is trying to capture Howard's use of language. I make little lists on Post-it notes of Robert E. Howard type words, and I put them up around my monitor when I'm writing these books. But it's good times. I mean, I generally write in a more terse style, although Howard was pretty. His descriptions and stuff are brief. They're evocative. They put pictures in your head, but he doesn't spend a lot of time on detail. So he and I were simpatico there. But his language is more purple than mine generally is. He was more of a wordsmith than I credit myself to be. So I kind of have to rise to the occasion and try to match the muscularity of his prose, and to put across, Conan written in a contemporary style to me just wouldn't work. And treating Conan like a contemporary character wouldn't work. So you have to write dialogue that seems, in period for a made-up fantasy era that isn't too stilted. But I kind of have fun with that. Sometimes you can use the stilted part of it for a little bit of humor. So anyway, yeah, I just like everything about writing them. I just had a blast in the three I wrote. We'll possibly write a fourth. I have a inkling of a plot line in my head. I basically know all the big action scenes I want to do. Now I just got to tie them together with characters and plot, and because that's the way I roll. Okay. We have another question here. Well, we have a bunch more questions here. Boom. I already did that one. Here we go. Trevor Shane Talbert. Modern comics love making big changes to established characters, usually prefaced with the idea that this is what the modern audience expects. If you were given carte blanche to make one major change to one established character, who would it be, and what would the change be? Changing characters for modern audiences, that's just a code word for making your stories political, and altering the characters beyond recognition. If you're revising or making changes to a character, there should be a real, reason for it. Like when, they made a change when the Batman TV show came on in 66. DC decided to make a change in the style of the art away from the, golden age look that Batman had had up to that point. Sort of modernized look of the book, and then and the character, and then of course the changes Denny O'Neil made, post the 1966 show to take Batman back to his roots. But all of these things were done not to reflect the mores of the day, because what is that? But to make changes that um, made sense in the character's evolution, and to make it appeal to a broader audience, not a modern audience, but a broader audience. And, the simple pragmatic matter of making the comics look more like the TV show. And then in the case of Denny O'Neil's, returning Batman to his core character, there it was to, maintain a readership post the television show. I mean, Batmania was over. They had to do something, make some practical changes to the character to keep the readership engaged. So changes like that make perfect sense. Now, as far as, what would I do to a major character, I've already made a change to a major character, that being Batman. Back when I was a kid, and this was in the middle of Batmania, I bought this Batman paperback at a drugstore, and it reprinted a lot of classic Batman stories in black and white in a paperback format. And this was the first time I'd ever read it was like an expanded retelling of Batman's origin done in the 50s by, I assume Bill Finger, and it looked like Dick Sprang. And in it, we find out that Batman's parents were killed by Joe Chill. And in the story, Batman captures Joe Chill, and I can't remember if he dies at the end of the story or he's sent to a life in prison. But even as a kid, I would have been, 11, 12 years old, I was really disappointed that Batman had caught the killer of his parents. I always assumed, up until then, I'd read lots and lots of Batman comics, I always assumed that Batman's killer was possibly still at large, that Batman never knew the identity of his parents' killer. And so there was no possibility that Batman would ever fully get revenge for his parents' death. And so his crusade on crime would go on and on and on, because without end. And that idea appealed to me as a kid. I wasn't articulating this in my head. I wasn't writing essays. I wasn't sitting, but that was the feeling I had. When you're a kid, you have feelings. You're all about feelings. You don't put them into words. You're like, this makes me feel funny. This makes me feel good. This makes me feel bad. This makes me feel sad. But you're not thinking about why. But these are the reasonings that I had for Batman's motivations. And to have it sort of a story that showed that there was an end to that, it's like, well, why would he keep on being Batman? He captured his parents' killer. He got the justice that he sought. Why would he continue on running around in a cape and boots in the middle of the night? And I addressed this in 0 Hour, which was a cross-title big DC Comics, event that allowed you to sort of, as Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-5, it allows you to have your characters become unstuck in time. And so I have Batman back in time, post his parents' death. And in his story, he discovers that Joe Chill was not the killer of his parents. And so it will now remain unknown who it was. Now, I make this continuity change, and it was as permanent as any continuity change made in a comic book, which is to say it was not permanent at all. I'm sure it's been debunked and done away with. It's no longer canon. But for the time that I was on the Bat titles, I was happy that in my Bat universe, Batman had never gotten the justice that he sought. Apparently, it was quite controversial amongst fans, controversial enough that it gets a mention on the Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon, bemoans my choice of changing Batman's origin. So anyway, yeah. So I already got to make the big change I always wanted to make ever since I was a kid. Okay, Dan C. I am rereading Punisher War Journal. In issue 3, Frank kidnaps and takes a drug gangster to the Pine Barrens to finish him off. The gangster escapes, and Frank has to chase him in the snow. This is very similar to season 3, episode 11 of The Sopranos. Have you noticed the similarity before? Do you think it inspired the episode? And have you noticed your writing having influence over other works? Yes and no. The Pine Barrens episode of Sopranos, I think it's generally considered the best episode of the series. It's if you talk to Soprano fans, they'll say that was their favorite episode. It is an awesome episode. And yes, I did have a similar storyline in Punisher Warzone number 3. But I will give the Soprano creators a pass because obviously when you're doing a mafia story, you're going to have a story where they take a guy out in the woods. The last ride is part of the, gangster milieu. They're obviously eventually going to get, they did several times they took people on last rides. So it's, I'm not going to say they took it. And the setting in the snow, as it turns out, I read a book written by the locations manager for The Sopranos, a fascinating book about the job of, building sets and finding existing locations to shoot things in and all the complications that ensue over the life of a television series. And in it, he talks a lot about this episode. And the day they were going to shoot it, they got denied access to the place where they were going to shoot it. And they quickly had to find another place and assemble the crew and begin shooting the following day. Well, overnight it snowed. Initially, the episode was not going to be shot in the snow, but it snowed. So they had to shoot it in the snow. And they had to rewrite a lot of stuff, specifically that Christopher and Paulie left tracks. Why couldn't they just follow their tracks back to the car? And they had to write a scene where it showed that they were wandering in circles to do away with that. Now, so I'm going to give them a pass. I mean, even if they had read the comic, I wasn't reinventing the wheel here. It was a last ride story. Now, have things been taken from me? Yeah. The movie Waterworld is largely lifted from Winterworld. The lead character, his motivations, some of the ancillary characters, the structure, general story structure of Waterworld is exactly like Winterworld. It's almost as if the people producing it wanted to adapt Winterworld, but thought shooting in a snow environment would be difficult and raise the budget. And of course, the laugh is on them because shooting on the water is always more expensive. And this was a disastrous shoot. The budget for this movie ballooned way beyond proportions and way beyond any box office had ever earned. An enormous flop, which makes me pleased. Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable. If you've read the Winterworld and you watch Waterworld, it's like, okay, yeah, they read Winterworld, but decided to do their own thing using a lot of the elements from mine and Jorge Zafino's creation. Another one is the movie Signs, the alien invasion movie, M. Night Shyamalan, Mel Gibson. It absolutely, Shyamalan is a comics fan, a self-admitted comics fan, obviously from the Unbreakable movies. He's a comics fan, and there's no way he didn't see Invasion 55, my series about an alien invasion, in which, surprise, surprise, the aliens turn out that water, H2O, is toxic to them, to their chemistry, body chemistry. And of course, that was the, big M. Night Shyamalan shocker Twilight Zone ending, is to find out that water is toxic to the aliens. I like to think that my story makes a whole lot more sense because the aliens invade New Mexico in the middle of a drought rather than a global invasion on a planet where it's always raining sometime. I mean, somewhere I live in Florida. It's always raining somewhere here. I don't even know why the weatherman even mentions rain, because they should combine rain with the traffic. Like if you're going here, you're going to get rained on. If you stay here or go over east a little bit, you're not going to see any rain. Anyway, if I met M. Night Shyamalan, there was no way on earth he could convince me that he had not read this comic. Of course, for legal reasons, he would never admit it. Okay, Matthew McClune. I've seen some quick videos on Carl Barks. I know you spoke fondly of his comics and how influential they are. I was surprised to find out that many didn't know he was the writer and artist until decades after because Disney and the publisher wouldn't let it out. Is this true? Do you have any comments on Carl and his unaccredited works? Did you ever meet him? I never met Carl Barks. I was never at a convention that he was at. I was always going up to the Phil Sewling Con in New York City because that was the big convention at the time in the early 70s. And I think he appeared at the one before I started going. And the one before that, Steve Ditko was at. So I missed out. I missed out on meeting him. I missed out on meeting John Stanley, who both people I would have, I'd loved to have shaken their hands. But to be quite honest with you, at that time, I didn't know anything about Carl Barks. In fact, I found out about Carl Barks at these conventions. Because remember, like you remember, back then, kids, there was no real fandom. There was a couple of people putting out mimeographed fanzines, single space type. and if you weren't one of their friends, you didn't even know about these fanzines. And so there was no organized information out there. The only thing I knew about Carl Barks was he was the quote unquote good duck artist. And for many, many years, he was known as only the good duck artist. No one knew his name because Disney didn't let you sign work. Everything was by Walt Disney. Disney didn't credit anybody on their children's books or comic books or anything else. So, it was just done in studio, in-house, by freelancers. So you really didn't get to know anybody's name. But it, but people began to recognize this duck story is different from this duck story. While they were all consistently good comics, the Barks stories were exceptional in so many ways that readers of a certain age, which generally, guys that were like a few years older than me, they were reading these comics as they came out. I was like, I read some Donald Duck comics, but I was completely unaware of any of this. And so readers began to recognize that there was somebody doing these comics that was better at it than the other people. And they began to recognize that, and they began to call this person the good duck artist because they weren't thinking about writers. Comic books are written by somebody. So Barks's more ambitious stories, more complex stories, more wonderfully plotted, meticulously plotted stories, funnier stories, stories that were more character driven and more accurate and more consistent in quality. And readers began to discern this, and how they began to recognize a Barks story from any of the other duck artist story was in this simple detail that Barks, he made a little pie slice in the pupil of his character's eyes. A lot of other people use like a half moon shape, but Barks always used this pie slice shape. And so his growing fan base, now they had a way to discern which Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comics were by the good duck artist. And then somewhere along the line in the late 60s, his name became public. Somebody looked into it far enough. His readers who started out as kids now reached adulthood in the late 60s, and they began to, who was this guy? And they find Carl Barks. And of course they give him his due as one of the major influences on the comic book medium as a whole. I mean, as I've said many, many times, Carl Barks taught us how to write comics. He was the first guy to really look at comics as a separate art form, not just a first cousin to the comic strip, but an entirely new medium of sequential storytelling. And he began to take this very seriously. And basically, all of us learned, either directly or indirectly, how to write comics from Carl Barks. So his influence was just simply huge. But yeah, back in the day, just prior to me entering fandom, his identity was a complete mystery. And it was solved just beforehand. And there were a lot of Barks fans. There were as many Carl Barks fans and Little Lulu fans in fandom as there were for EC or the Marvel and DC superheroes and all the rest of it. It was a big fan base, a vocal fan base, and a fan base with money, because these comics were going for a lot of cash back in the day. I mean, when a comic book that was 15 years old is selling for $20 back in the 70s, that was a big deal. That meant that this is something special. So it wasn't really until later years that I began to look more into Barks, because I heard so much about the guy, and I'm a comic book guy. It's like, I want to know more about this guy, and began reading and appreciating the stuff more. And of course, now with Fantagraphics doing these like beautiful collections of everything Barks, we can all take a peek and see what that guy was up to. And he was up to some awesome stuff. Garrett Davis, I liked your video showing your office. I noticed you had a Dogs of War poster by your door. It's a bit strangely edited at moments, but I quite like that movie and have seen it 3 times. I guess I just like Mercenaries in Africa plot lines. Anyway, I wanted to know if you've read the book the film was based on by Frederick Forsyth. He wrote Day of the Jackal and Odessa File. Yeah, I read all that stuff. I did read the book. It was based on, the movie is, as you know, somewhat different than the book. The character is different, but the major plot line is the same. Mercenaries hired to take down a regime of a small African country. But yeah, I dig this movie a lot. I remember I saw this movie. I was out and about. It was not a real happy time in my life. And I was out and about running errands in another town. And I saw that this movie was playing at the local theater. And just on a whim, I just said, screw my errands. I just went in and saw it. And I loved every minute of it. And I've watched this movie most times I watch this more than once a year, rewatch it, because I just like the structure. I like Christopher Walken's portrayal. It's an unusual role for Walken. He was not perceived as like the action hero. And in this movie, he's not really an action hero. He's not Rambo. He's not Schwarzenegger. It's far more realistic portrayal. And I like the sly humor, dark humor of the story, and just it's a good story plainly told, and that's my favorite kind of story. I mean, the story is so solid. You don't have to do a lot of artsy stuff. You don't have to do a lot of melodrama to push the story forward and make it seem important. The story, it doesn't tell itself, but the filmmakers made it seem that way, that the story just sort of unfolds before you. There's no contrivances, there's no obvious setups and things like that, but but there are setups. They're very subtly laid in place and then paid off beautifully every step of the way. And not only do I occasionally just watch this movie out of the blue, but sometimes I'll make a day of it. And I'll watch Dogs of War, always followed by Dark of the Sun, the 1960s African mercenary movie with Rod Taylor and Jim Brown, which is just an awesomely brutal action film, especially for the period it was made in. And then I'll follow that up with Tears of the Sun, another military in Africa movie, this time the United States military, Navy SEALs, I believe, going to rescue Americans from the horrors of a African Civil War. starring Bruce Willis. So I'll just make a day of it. A mercenaries in Africa trifecta. Okay. Mattel Jones. One of my favorite childhood memories is having my parents take me to see Where Eagles Dare during the original run in theaters. Where Eagles Dare is like a James Bond film set in World War II, with Burton as Bond and Eastwood being a more than great Felix Leiter backup. One of my favorite parts is when Major Smith is confronted by the surprise appearance of the SS soldier, how quickly he adjusts his cover story to amusing effect. Speaking of that SS officer von Hoppen, as played by Darren Nesbitt, has any actor ever looked more like a Jerry Anderson puppet? Also, does any Clint Eastwood movie have him racking up a bigger body count than this one? Yeah, I remember my parents took me to see this one at the local drive-in, and I just, wow, what a movie. It's got everything. It's got Nazis and, daring do. And it's a real boys' own adventure movie. It's Alistair McLean stuff at his best, and stuff blowing up and all the rest of it. Yeah, it is kind of like a James Bond movie set in World War II because it's, undercover stuff and, dastardly villains and it's also has like heist movie elements to it that make it really cool. And of course, it's fantastic stunts done on the cable cars. I mean, just great stuff. I mean, we can even excuse the appearance of a helicopter in the movie. I assume they could not get an auto gyro for some reason, and they had to have that helicopter landing in the castle. It was like, okay, that's a little off-putting, but the rest of the movie looked fairly accurate. And Richard Burton, yeah, he's smooth as James Bond. He's a womanizer. He's got away with the ladies. He's got all the answers. He's quick on his feet. He's tough. He's a killer. He's got no compunction about killing anybody that gets in his way. And he's always going to win the day, and we know that. Cool and British and drinking a lot. Apparently drinking a whole lot on the set of this movie, if Clint Eastwood is to be believed. Clint Eastwood always, I think to this day, refers to this movie as Where Eagles Drink. And then you cracked me up with the Darren Nesbitt reference to a Jerry Anderson puppet. I think that's what's bothered me about this character since I first saw it. It's like there's something about this guy. It seems vaguely familiar, and you nailed it. He could have been a cast member of Fireball XL5. So that cracked me up. So from now on, I'll that'll be in my head when I see this guy. I'll be looking for the strings. And then you are absolutely right. This is Clint Eastwood's biggest body count. I would say this is the biggest body count in a movie until Star Wars. I mean, I once clocked it. I've seen this movie many, many times, as you have. I once clocked it, and the last 45 minutes of this movie is nothing but killing. I mean, things are either blowing up, people are getting shot, motorcycles are flying off of cliffs, airplanes are exploding. It's the last 45 minutes is pure carnage, which that's pretty incredible. That's pretty incredible. Matt Rex. Hello, Mr. Dixon. I just finished reading your short story and neither beg nor yield and enjoyed it. Is this the first Hagen and Pilsner story you've written? Do you plan on doing another? Do you dislike writing short stories for anthology books? Why or why not? Would you consider doing this again? Yeah, I contributed a story to this anthology of sword and sorcery stories. And, I got invited out of the blue. I didn't know the people putting this together or anything else. And they said, would you like to contribute a short story? And my answer is always, well, if I think of a story, I get invited to contribute to anthologies all the time. But I rarely do it because I have to think of a story. And if I don't bother. I'm not just going to dash something off just to be included in the anthology. And I'm not that kind of writer. It's like, okay, we need, 4,000 words by Thursday and here's your subject. Okay, I can't do that. I mean, the story has to come from somewhere. I don't know how other writers do that. I don't know if they have a formula or a template they just fall back on and they just sort of, plug the characters in. I've never been that kind of writer. So but they said, would you want to? And I said, well, let me think about it. And it took a while. I think it was a few months later. I was like, yeah, you know what? I don't necessarily have a story, but I have two characters in mind. Hagen and Pilsner are a pair of mercenaries. I was thinking of Fafford and the Grey Mouser, the Fritz Lieber stories. And I'd like to do something in that vein. Because, I've been writing the Conan novels. And it's like, they're grim and serious for the most part. And I thought, well, something a little lighter in tone, a little bit more of a, like almost a parody story, although not, jokey, has humor in it, but not comedy. And I wanted sort of a buddy story. And so, I said, yeah, I might have these characters. And then I thought a little bit more about it and came up with, a sturdy storyline with surprises and twists and changes for them to go through. But mostly I enjoyed writing the repartee between the two characters. Would I do it again? Yeah, like I said, if someone invites me to write for an anthology and, here's the genre or here's the character, yeah, as long as I can think of a story for them. I've contributed to a Kolchak, a Spider anthology. I've contributed to 2 Lone Ranger anthologies, and obviously I would do it again as long as I can come up with a story. But I'm not one of those guys that can just at the drop of a hat, dump 5,000 words on within a week. So I'm just not that kind of guy. Okay. Mark Neer, I note that the film is again being planned for Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I love No Country for Old Men, both the book and the movie. Blood Meridian will be interesting if it happens. If Cormac McCarthy's heirs ask you to adapt some of his novels into comics, would you take that challenge? How about if the task was not to adapt the novels but to base your comic script based on the film versions? I haven't seen or read The Road, but I would welcome your comments also on that. Yeah, I gotta say no. I wouldn't want to do comic adaptations of Cormac McCarthy stuff. I love Cormac McCarthy's writing, and I guess that's the reason why I wouldn't want to do it. His novels are, for the most part, unfilmable. The Coen brothers pulled off an amazing feat of filmmaking when they brought No Country for Old Men to the screen. Now, they had to cut a lot of stuff, which I'm sure hurt them. They cut some of my favorite scenes in the novel, but they were staying with the core of the story, the core of what McCarthy was trying to put across. And of course, the action scenes in the movie are right out of the book. I mean, McCarthy has a way of describing action. And action is not easy for a lot of writers, but he has a way of describing action that just draws you in. You can just see everything. You're in the moment. You feel it. You can't put it down. You've got to see what happens next. He is an absolute master of you've got to see what happens next. But what I like about McCarthy's writing is he is a true invisible writer. I had to reread scenes from All the Pretty Horses over and over and over again to try to figure out, how does he make me feel this way? I mean, he's not telling me how to feel. He's not giving me any really clear, melodramatic indicators. There's nothing in the dialogue, but something in his word choice, something in his pacing, something in his descriptions is either making me feel creeped out or making me feel like something, imminently bad is going to happen. How does he do that? Guy is a real master. I'd love to know. Maybe I don't want to know because he is an invisible handwriter. I don't want to know how he did it. I don't want to know. I mean, I see what he does on examination. I think I'm seeing how he's doing this, but I don't really want to know. I don't want to ever read about, I don't want to read about him writing about his process. And I don't think Cormac McCarthy ever wrote about his process because he wasn't that kind of writer. He was about, hey, I wrote it, take it or leave it, love it or hate it. This is what I wrote, that's it. That is all I wrote. And I'm not telling you about it or describing it or justifying or apologizing for anything I've done. And so, yeah, I don't know how well it would translate to the comic form. Every other movie made from his stuff, All the Pretty Horses, Son of Man, and The Road have fallen far short of the power of the books. So, why bother? And Blood Meridian, which they keep trying to film it, and I was reading the history of it. I mean, Tommy Lee Jones owned the rights for a while. James Franco owned the rights for a while. Like almost every major filmmaker in Hollywood outside of Woody Allen and Clint Eastwood have taken a look at this book and thought it would make a good movie. It wouldn't make a good movie. If you were to be absolutely painstakingly accurate to the novel, you would end up with just 2 hours of misery. This book it's about scalp hunters, I believe in the 1840s, who go back and forth across the Mexican border, hunting Indians to sell their scalps. And it's like all McCarthy books, it's a page turner, but you're horrified. I mean, it's a stomach churning violence in this book. These are awful, awful characters. I don't want to see a movie about this. No movie could do this book justice. And, without being like triple X rated and unwatchable, unwatchable. This would be more grotesque than like the most grotesque Italian giallo you've ever seen. And why would you want to make that into a movie? I think the reason why is there's one scene in this book. It's an extended action scene that would be spectacular on screen in the right hands, in the hands of a Coen brothers or Scorsese at the top of his form, or Terrence Malick at the top of his form. But it's not worth making a whole movie for one great scene. It's in the book. You can read it. It's fantastic. But yeah, I don't. Please, Hollywood, don't do this. There's no reason to. And you're not going to make any money. See, the dirty little secret of Hollywood is that movies make money at the box office, real money, when people go back to see it over and over and over again. You have it's the same as with gambling and the liquor business. You rely on addicts and drunks for most of your money. It's called repeat customers. And movies really rely on a core fan base, a certain percentage of the viewers going back to see it again and again and again. I mean, this is why Star Wars made so much money. This is why Jaws made so much money, because people went back over and over and over again. And you would see Blood Meridian once if you could sit through the whole thing, and you'd never want to see it again. And that means no Blu-ray sales, no DVD sales. You put it on streaming and nobody's going to watch it. So why would you make this movie? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Now, as far as The Road, the movie was not anywhere near as powerful as the book. And The Road is McCarthy writ even larger, because I talked about how he sets up a feeling of dread, like that something terrible is going to happen in the next few pages, and you want to look away, but you can't. That's The Road from the page one to the end. That feeling of dread just rises and rises and rises. I mean, you're tensing up reading the book. You gotta turn the page, but you don't want to turn the page. And when I read The Road, I bought it. I went to our local Target and I saw it there on the stands. Oh, wow, McCarthy's new book is out. I'm going to pick this up. And I bought it at Target, and I went into a little coffee shop they have there, and I bought a coffee, and I sat down and thought, well, let me look at it. You buy a new book and you want to take a look at it. And I read the opening lines. And an hour and a half later, I reached the end of the book. I never got up. I don't even think I drank my coffee. I just read that book from beginning to end, sitting there at Target. And I was just, it shook me. It shook me like no other book had ever shaken me, because this book gets a hold of you and does not let go. And that's been the case for most of McCarthy's books. I mean, I read All the Pretty Horses on a flight to California. By the time I got off the plane, I was done with the book. I think I read No Country for Old Men in 2 sittings. Blood Meridian took a little longer because it's nasty. There's just so much of that you can handle. But at the time, I did a drawing of myself reading The Road. And the joke here is I was afraid to look at the book with both eyes. So, Anyway, General Savage, Mr. Dixon, what are your thoughts on conspiracy theories? Are there any conspiracy theories that you think are more true than people give them credit for, or any conspiracy theories that you've heard that you might find particularly interesting? The thing about conspiracy theories is that what do you want to believe? And a lot of times people will only see the evidence that backs up what they already wanted to believe about the world. Here's my take on conspiracies, and I'm going to provide evidence for this. Conspiracies are hard. JFK assassination, there's a million different conspiracies. And the where it falls apart is that all of them, every single one of the JFK conspiracy theories, he was killed by Castro, he was killed by the communists, he was killed by a bunch of Texas oil billionaires, he was killed by the CIA. All of these theories fall apart in the light that, people can't keep secrets, especially one this big. And in every one of these conspiracy theories, it would require the cooperation of hundreds of people to stay mum about the assassination of the president of the United States. No deathbed confessions, no letters left in a vault to be opened upon my death. None of this has ever come out. No one's come forward to say, yeah, I was the guy in the grassy knoll, or yeah, I set this up, or whatever. And so as far as conspiracy theories, I believe that there's no such thing as a global conspiracy. What you have to understand is that a lot of times it's not a conspiracy, it's an understanding. And there are people involved in a lot of different chicaneries. I mean, we're seeing it now more than ever, with collusion between the government and the media and the intelligence agencies and corporations, and you're seeing all of this collusion. Well, the thing is, it's not a conspiracy because it's happening in plain sight. We can all see it happening, and they'll deny it's happening, but we can see it happening. And again and again and again, there's more and more proof that you folks are colluding. But it's not a conspiracy. It's an understanding that we all have the same goal. Right now, our goals are in line with one another, and we're all going to cooperate. This is the story we're going to stick to. And example being that I really believe that, the ingredients of the JFK thing, it begs for conspiracy, because here you have Lee Harvey Oswald murdered just a few days after, murdered by some guy. They try to create stories about, Jack Ruby, the killer of Lee Harvey Oswald, who kills Oswald just a few days after Oswald assassinates the president. And I saw this live on TV when I was a kid. One of the most shocking thing I've ever seen on television. The sort of surprise moment where he's killed by Jack Ruby, and all these things trying to link Jack Ruby to the mafia, to the CIA, to Fidel Castro. I agree with Lenny Bruce's assessment of Jack Ruby, that he saw himself as the Jewish Lone Ranger. He thought he was going to be a hero. And if you read anything about this guy, nightclubs, strip clubs, things like this, and he's going to make a name for himself. But Oswald is killed, and so we learn no more about Oswald. And with Oswald out of the way, the media is able to create a story on its own. And here's where we come into the understanding, not a conspiracy, but an understanding. So the news media is able to run with and tell whatever story they want to tell about the assassination and what happened that day. To the point where CBS News, through Walter Cronkite, broke the news to the nation that the president was dead. Now, they got this news from Dan Rather, who was a stringer for CBS News in Dallas, who followed the ambulance to the hospital, couldn't get anybody to talk to him. Of course not. You're just a stringer for CBS. You're a nobody. Nobody would talk to him. Nobody would give him any answers. And Rather, who admits this in one of his biographies, flipped a coin. And he called CBS and said the president was dead. He didn't know. He had no idea. He knew nothing about President Kennedy's wounds or anything else. He simply guessed. And his thinking was, if I'm right, my career is made. If I'm wrong, I'm finished in this business. Well, unfortunately for the rest of us, and luckily for him, JFK was dead. And Cronkite goes on the air and informs the nation. And then the media immediately begins creating their own version of what happened that day, and largely ignoring the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. I mean, a real communist. He was a former Marine, dishonorably discharged, goes to the Soviet Union, marries a Russian woman, and comes back to the United States, full-blown commie pinko agitator, as well as an expert Marine marksman. But the media, because the media was so, at this time, dominated by what they called the anti-communists. These were American liberals who rejected the Joe McCarthy and the House on Un-American Activity. They rejected the findings. These are the people who insisted that Alger Hiss was innocent, a communist spy in the government. They insisted that the Rosenbergs, the couple that sold America's atomic secrets to the Russians, that they were framed. They were anti. They weren't communists themselves. They weren't even communist sympathizers. They just poo-pooed the idea that there were communist Soviet spies in America, which is ludicrous. There are spies in every country, from every country, but they would deny that there was any communist influence in this country whatsoever, which we know now. They could not have been more wrong. That the Soviets had their fingers in academia, the media, everywhere else. They had their apologists and their sympathizers. They had people, American citizens who held rank in Soviet military intelligence. But the anti-communists basically begin creating alternate versions of what happened on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, simply to create a narrative taking the American public's mind off the fact that JFK was killed by a communist. He was killed by an enemy of our country. So they began to cast their net wide and sort of make the story fuzzy and blurry so that conspiracy theories could sprout everywhere and you could blame everybody but our nation's actual enemy in the Cold War. And this is where you see it's not a conspiracy, it's an understanding. They all had the same goal. Their goal was anti-communism, to poo-poo the influence of the Soviet Union in our society. And this is the reason why they hated Richard Nixon. He was a virulent anti-communist. Let's not forget, JFK was a virulent anti-communist as well. And it's just undeniable. Now, whether it was a plot by the Soviet Union or Oswald was driven by his own, zany idea of how to promote world communism, we don't know. We're never going to know. And why are we never going to know? Because the CIA, to this day, will not release the records from the time period of the Kennedy assassination. And it's way past the deadline. And we should have seen those files. There should have been total transparency, total sunshine on all of the JFK information years ago. But they keep finding reasons. They go, oh, well, it reveals methods and practices and people would put in danger. This happened decades and decades and decades ago. No one involved in any aspect of the Kennedy era is alive now. There's nobody that's going to be exposed. There are no methods and practices from 1963 that we don't already know all about. So there's no grand secret Now here's where you go, well, then it's obviously a conspiracy. They're covering up a conspiracy. No, they're covering up their own screw-ups because they should have nailed Oswald in Mexico City. They were following him around. They were peeking at him. They knew where he was. They knew about his movements. They knew he was a danger. They knew he was a threat, and yet they did nothing about it. Now, did they do nothing about it because they hoped that he would kill the president? No, that's ridiculous because there was no guarantee he was going to succeed. He had the best shooting day of his life that day in Dealey Plaza. There was no guarantee he was going to be able to kill the president. So why would they let that happen? They let it happen because our government agencies, CIA, FBI, they are really good at watching people. They're not very good at catching people. They're not investigators. They're not detectives. They're not driven to, make an arrest, seek justice, and put people in jail or prevent catastrophe. They're just sort of watching and watching and watching, hoping that whoever they're watching will lead them to bigger fish. And those bigger fish will lead them to promotions within their own bureaus. And that's the simple fact of the matter. Once again, it's an understanding. It's not a conspiracy. It's people with their own petty little goals. So the reason why the CIA does not want you to see any of the stuff surrounding the presidential assassination in 1963 is because they don't want you to see what a bunch of foul-ups they were. And because it would embarrass the agency, and they certainly should be embarrassed. Remember, so much of what you see in the political world and the world of government is kabuki theater. I hate you, you hate me, you're a monster, you're a Nazi, and then we all go golfing together. Is it a conspiracy? No, it's an understanding. We're better than you. You slob, you jerk, you hoi polloi. We know better than you. And of course, we see what that's done as our experts, quote unquote, get dumber and dumber as the years go on. Speaking of conspiracies, hey, Alt Hero Q Volume 1. It's a big old hardcover, oversized hardcover collection of my Arctoon series, Alt Hero Q, about Roland Dane, a rogue treasury agent who follows a world-spanning conspiracy to what ends up being a conflict between Ukraine and Russia that I predicted 2 years before it happened, within the pages of a comic book, no less. If you want to find out about Roland Dane, you can pick up the book directly from Arkhaven. And like I say, it's a big, fat, oversized hardcover, really beautiful edition. I'm very, very proud of it. It's got some, terrific artwork and action and suspense and a little bit of something on its mind. So anyway, that's it for me this week, my friends. I thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. And